Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Linda Miller, and I'm the host for today's discussion. Since 2020, May of 2020, I've been leading a project for the Reynolds Journalism Institute aimed at equipping local media to report on and compete in an inclusive economy. Early on in the project, I came across research about how US journalists in white-led media cover the economy almost exclusively as it relates to the fortunes of the wealthy. And so as income inequality worsens, news about the national economy tends to be more positive. And as inequality decreases, economic news trends negative. And I thought, this has to change, especially if journalists are going to keep pace with and report on any post-COVID economic recovery, as well as efforts to dismantle structural racism and address the disparities caused by it. And so today we have the privilege of hearing from 4 media professionals who are leading that change. And they're doing it by centering the stories, experiences, and insights of people who are too often marginalized in and by stories about the economy, and who are also working to change the very systems that exclude them by design. For the first 30 minutes or so, our speakers will offer insights into the narratives that they're trying to change and create and how they're going about that. And then we'll take some of your questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature rather than just posting it in the chat. And that way it'll be easier for us to keep track of questions and not miss anything. Also, we'll be sending everyone who registered a link to a recording of today's discussion, as well as a resource guide that will have contact and other bio information for our panelists, links to all the stories, websites, and other materials that will be mentioned today. So we're still waiting for Keiona to join us, but we're going to go ahead and I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll welcome Keiona when she joins us. So with us today is Twila Dang, founder and CEO of Matriarch Digital Media and co-host of the public media podcast, Small Change: Money Stories from the Neighborhood. We also have Oscar Abello, senior economics correspondent for Next City. Sarah Gustavus, Economic Mobility Initiatives Manager for Solutions Journalism Network, and soon to be joining us, Kiana Williamson, who is editor of the Sacramento Bee's Equity Lab. I'd like to start by just asking each of you to briefly tell us about the work you do and the narratives you're trying to change or create through that work. And so we're going to start with Twila.
Hi. So the work, particularly the work that we do at Minnesota Public Radio around the podcast Small Change: Money Stories from the Neighborhood is it's based in a very specific core principle, which is we wanted to reframe who would be considered financial experts. Traditionally, financial literacy is based in people with lots of degrees, oftentimes people from very privileged backgrounds or a combination of high experiential plus privilege, talking primarily to audiences that don't have those same access to resources, that don't have that same knowledge and background to be able to put and implement complex financial practices into motion. We decided we wanted to talk about something completely different. In reality, some of the people who know the most about money and how to manage it day to day and how to be creative and collaborative with finances are people with low and unstable incomes. And we decided we wanted to frame them as the experts. In order to do that, we were able to work with some community partners to help identify organizations, programs, and even individuals who were doing really interesting work to help support the types of learning that we were trying to, put on display. One of the biggest things for us was in our own learning and in framing out how we talk to that community was really a basic language change in how we talk to that community. Often you hear people like this referred to as low-income people. That's not what they are. These are people with low and unstable incomes who are a part of our community and find themselves in a very specific circumstance. But they are members of our community and they're fellow people just like us. And that turned out to be one of the biggest decisions that we made, and it had the biggest impact on the work we were able to do.
Thanks. You're going to go now?
Sorry, was that tossing it to me, or?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Oscar, do you want to go
Oh,
next?
sorry. Yeah, you broke up for a second. Hi, everyone. Great to meet you, Twila and Sarah. Good to see you. I'm Oscar Abello, the Senior Economics Correspondent at Next City. And Next City as a publication, we cover racial, social, and economic and environmental justice in cities across the country. We were founded in 2003, and I've been there since 2015, basically doing what I do now as Senior Economics Correspondent. And what I do now is essentially covering, economic development from the perspective of disinvested or historically marginalized communities. And in kind of on the same token as Twila mentioned, trying to look at into a certain group of households who are traditionally not seen as experts, looking at them as experts. I'm looking at people and organizations in neighborhoods who are not traditionally seen as doing economic development, or at least they're not doing it in the traditional economic development sense of creating jobs or creating businesses or developing real estate. And I'm looking at what are they actually doing to create jobs and create wealth and create real estate or develop real estate. These neighborhoods I live in New York City, so I'm thinking about, the South Bronx, Central Brooklyn, Far East Queens, Upper Manhattan, or, if you're in Minnesota, I'm looking at the North Side. I'm looking at in St. Paul, over on like Frogtown in that area, or like just east of that area. I'm looking at the south and west side of Chicago, anywhere in Detroit outside of downtown, the north side of St. Louis, South LA, or what used to be known as South Central LA, Oakland, West Oakland, East Oakland in particular. What are the folks in those neighborhoods doing to create jobs, to create wealth, to take ownership of land? It's a lot of work, and I've been doing it for 5 years, and they have different models of doing it too. Sometimes it's a traditional kind of community bank, credit union kind of financing model. Sometimes there are different models for financing and ownership that people are adopting for different reasons. And I'm reporting on and exploring how are they coming across these models? Why are they choosing to do it this way? And what is the work required to actually move these models forward and create, and like I said, create jobs, create businesses, create wealth. These are and I guess one way I sort of kind of keep tabs on myself in order to understand whether or not I'm doing that is, since 2015, when I started writing for Next City, I started keeping tabs on the demographics of my sources. So I keep track and I share the results of that to kind of make sure that, yes, I'm telling the story of economic development from the perspective of historically marginalized neighborhoods and people, and I'm lifting up their voices and making sure that they are getting the credit that they're due, I think, for the work that economic development requires.
Thanks, Oscar. Sarah, tell us a little about your work and what you're doing with SJN and newsrooms around the country.
Sure. So with our Economic Mobility Initiative and Minnesota Public Radio and Next City are two of the newsrooms that we're working with in our cohorts. It's so exciting to see Oscar and Twila on the call. I work to support journalists and news organizations. That's what I do as an initiative manager at SJN. That happens through training, funding to support stories, ongoing coaching and support and helping people problem solve in the reporting process for finding the right people or overcoming challenges that they're facing, and also capacity building of newsrooms to incorporate solutions journalism into their coverage, to generate revenue off of it, to tell the story about why solutions journalism matters for funders, for their audience, and to just do great reporting. We like to say that solutions journalism tells a more accurate story. It tells the whole story of what's happening in communities, similar to what Twila was saying. Like, the relentless focus on what is wrong and what is broken does not actually give people the full story. People know that there are folks doing great work in their communities to address things. There are people's voices who haven't been heard, perspectives on issues that haven't been heard in a lot of journalism in the past. And so we're trying to shift that and giving journalists the tools and resources to do so. We created an economic mobility reporting guide with Resolve Philly. I co-wrote that with Aubrey Nagel, and that has a language and framing section that speaks to some of the issues that Twila raised about how we talk about people in our stories and the words that we use. I've also been doing a lot of work at SJN around the idea of asset framing and how do we introduce people in stories and how do we get away from defining people and communities as a problem or as a deficit, and highlight the aspirations and the contributions of people in our journalism to tell a more complete story. So this work is really personally important to me. I tell people often that I almost left journalism. I was working as a journalist in New Mexico, which is a state with high poverty rates. A lot of the coverage is just the reports every year about how it's the worst, things are the worst. I guess when I first got into journalism, I believed that idea that if you just exposed wrongdoing and you exposed what was wrong, that people would be outraged and they would do something. And I think the research shows, and we've seen anecdotally, that people actually get paralyzed. Or I think officials sometimes say, well, it's so terrible, how could we ever fix it? It's always going to be this way. And solutions journalism for me was the way to do really great reporting, but that did more, that actually informed the community in new ways, that gave people a little bit of hope, that also gave people real details about what was working and why. And so that is what drives me to do this work now at SJN, and what inspires me about the amazing newsrooms that we are so fortunate to be able to work with.
You know, that idea about people being seen as not just affected by something, but having the power and embracing the power to affect change in their communities is something that, I've certainly seen in all of your work. And, Oscar, 6 days after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, you wrote a piece on Medium called "The Power and Brilliance of Black People." And it was later republished on Next City. And in it, you cite like numerous examples of Black Americans who are building a better and safer world. And the article touches on several concepts that I see throughout your reporting, like solidarity, subsidiarity, we've discussed that before, and resourcefulness. And why is that? And why is that important to your approach and how you do this work and the narratives that media sort of help to create?
Well, to go back to the Medium piece, I put that together almost as a post on like social media or Medium, because in those days after George Floyd was murdered, now we know we can say he was murdered by police. There were other impulses floating around, like, well, okay, so the police are doing this in Black communities, brown communities, and they're over policing these communities, and part of it is because of the economic disinvestment that's occurred in those communities, and so it's criminalized and over policed and over incarcerated. And whenever I start to hear or come across discussions of like certain communities being broken somehow, so-called broken, I get worried that other powerful people who may, out of the goodness of their own heart, care and want to do something, will then want to go and do something. They're in a position to do something. They're a mayor, they're a council member, they're a president, they're a legislator at the state or federal or local level. They want to do something. And that impulse isn't necessarily bad, but I worry that it's underinformed. I worry that when someone is in a position of power, they've gotten to be in the position of power through some measure of privilege, perhaps, and now they're going to go out and say, let's go do something about the problem. Let's go invest in these communities so that they're not over policed. Well, guess what? These communities you're talking about, they have been doing this work. They have been trying to develop themselves, invest in themselves, create jobs for themselves, create businesses, create wealth, take control of land for themselves. They've been doing it all along. And that's why, I can do that post. It takes me like 10 minutes to put it together, because all I do is just, well, let's see over the past year, how many times have I written about Black communities and what are they doing? And, the post is basically a laundry list of like, here's this story, this story, this story, different cities, different models, different contexts in every one. But the overall kind of context is, in Black communities, Black people are doing things to try to make their communities better. And within many of those stories, not all of them, but many of those stories, you do find there are ways for powerful people, privileged folks, people with wealth, people in positions of power, people who have the power to move public resources. There are ways they can join in and support these efforts. One of the things I wrote about I've been writing about the past couple of years is this real estate cooperative in Oakland. It's called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And it's a cooperative where we're going to create a real estate entity where the residents and the tenants, or the users of the buildings, are going to have the most power in the ownership of this thing. But we're going to have investors too, and the investors will have some say because investors are risking their capital. They deserve some say, but the residents are going to have the most say, and the community around each of those buildings is going to have a lot of say. And so the idea that to go back to your point, like in these communities where we hear about disinvestment and problems that need to be fixed, guess what? They are already trying to fix it, and it doesn't mean they can do it by themselves. I also have to caution against the idea that, oh, if you just leave Black communities alone, everything will get fixed. That is also misguided, because the whole economy has been designed from the very beginning, from 1619, to extract wealth, to extract resources from certain communities, from land, from people. And it's still doing that. And we have to, number one, stop doing that. And number two, maybe we need to think about returning some of the wealth that was stolen from certain communities. Without doing that, we'll never really close the disparities. But I don't want folks to go into situations like, oh, we need to invest in Black communities in Minneapolis, and that's all we need to do. It doesn't matter how we do it. Because the way we do it matters a lot. And we can talk for hours and hours about the way we invest in communities, how it matters and why it matters. And it's not just automatic that money coming into a community is going to help that community. It's not.
Yeah, I see a lot of head nodding here. Twila, speaking of community, in your NPR podcast, you focus on interviewing community members who are, as what Oscar was talking about, redefining wealth, the value of community, the purpose of money. But that wasn't the original plan, right? So what changed your thinking and your approach?
That's easy. We came in, I'll be perfectly honest and say, we came in from what I now fully admit to was, a pretty arrogant place. It was, we're going to do financial literacy, and we're going to teach people how to be more financially literate. And we're going to, find new and interesting ways to share that information with people. And we still knew we literally had a core idea that we wanted this to be reframed from a different perspective, but we were still putting sort of wrong-headed thinking on top of a new idea. So it wasn't until we got into the interviews, we had started scheduling our first interviews, and we talked to one particular woman, and I name check her every time because she really just made us go, rethink it all. Her name was Tanya Brinston, and she told us about 30 seconds into her interview that people will have you thinking that financial assets are the only assets with value. And when she said that, we went, wait, what are you talking about? Like, talk to us. And she started to tell us about her community. She started telling us about her neighborhood, quite literally her neighbors and friends. She said, I haven't got my hair done in the salon in 20 years. I go to my friend's house and she does my hair in her kitchen. And she's really good. So when other people say my hair looks good, I tell them to go see her. She said, when I bought my first house, because that's how we met Tanya, she was an empty nester who had purchased her first home. And she had a friend who was a contractor. So when she bought this house and the roof wasn't the best, she knew she could buy the house and he could help her do the work. She had next door neighbors, and they said, hey, we have a garden. We always have way more than we can use. Anytime you want to go over and grab tomatoes, go grab tomatoes out of the garden. And hearing her tell these stories did two things. It made us go, wait a second. Personal assets are of value. They're actually a financial asset because they help you save costs and they help you find different and imaginative ways to take care of your needs without having to come up with, X amount of dollars every single month. It also triggered a bunch of memories for us. I had that experience. Chris had that experience. More people we talked to had that experience. of you had an uncle that was really good at this, that was a tinkerer, that always fixed all the stuff in your house, and nobody ever had to get their car fixed or an electronic fix because he could do it. You had, another relative who, kind of had a side hustle before side hustles were a thing, where they made plates on Sundays, or where they, or where they were the one who always baked cakes for everybody in the neighborhood for special occasions. We saw this again and again and again. And if Tanya hadn't said that and immediately sort of shifted our thinking to, wait, are we actually framing the experts we say we're framing? I think we were thinking we were going to talk to people who had gone through a program or had an experience, or had built something, and we could say, look what they did, and we'll give you tips to follow their footsteps. But in reality, we needed to focus on the people who were living in the everyday, who were doing, sometimes simple things, sometimes complex things, but they were deeply invested, not just in their own survival and their own success, but the people around them, the community around them, the cultural background that they came from, the city that they lived in. They cared. And because they cared, they were doing all of these wonderful things in very tangible ways to help advance themselves and other people. We walked away from that meeting with her that day saying, okay, I think we're onto something. I think we now understand that we're not in any position to do the teaching. We're only in the position to do the listening, the learning, and the sharing of the information. And every single person we talked to after that just added another layer and another layer and another layer. We still jokingly tell her all the time, like, thank goodness you showed up when you did. Thank goodness we scheduled you early. Because if you hadn't, we might have gotten through an entire season of the show where we didn't have a full understanding of what we were really supposed to do. And we would have missed out on the opportunity to really hear the types of stories that changed everything.
Just to follow up on that one thing about cultural, like cultural differences and approaches to money and wealth building, there's another story that you explore about that idea about the difference between like putting the wealth and health of the community before sort of individual prosperity. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Store?
Yeah, about the grocery store.
So I'll plug this episode all day because I love it. So many of you might know Bo Tawarabe. She is a community leader here in the Twin Cities. She's an amazing human being. And she sat down to do an interview with us, and she started explaining to us how her family's dynamic works. She has a very large family, a large extended family. But in their family, if someone needs something, they basically just go to everybody in family and explain what they need and what they're trying to do. They don't so she had an uncle, and her uncle wanted to start a grocery store. He approached the adults in the family and said, I'd like to start a grocery store. This is how much money I'm probably gonna need. This is where I wanna put it. And there wasn't okay, well, we'll have a meeting, we'll have a vote. We'll talk to each other and get back to you. Can you fill out this application? It was, he's a member of our family. We love him. He wants to do this. We'll all give what we can. And that's what they did. They all gave what they could, whether it was small amounts or large amounts. And he was able to open his grocery store. And now his grocery store is a great success. And in turn, because they invested in him, because they love him, he was able to do something really wonderful. And it's not even about paying it back or, having, like shares in the store. Nobody owns the store. Nobody has an ownership piece of the store. It belongs to him. They love him, their family, they made sure he got what he needed. And now in turn, he takes care of, they essentially have a very large family, like 150 family members. And anytime they have a gathering pre-COVID, he would provide all the food. It just turned out to be, that's just a very small way of him being able to, return it. And she said, she says all the time, what he's, what little we gave him, has been more than paid back. In terms of, just reinvestment in the family and him being able to contribute when the next person needed something. But we found it remarkable just how, just how selfless that the act it was of him just saying, I need something. And they all just said, okay.
It brings to mind, like, referencing back to that research that I talked about in the opening. It's like that idea of telling the story of the economy with these big aggregate indicators like stock market and, GDP and consumer spending that rarely disaggregate that data by race or by place or by community, and showing like this, that sort of small economy as a way in journalism. When you're reporting on that, you're giving people a different picture of the health of your community, right? You're actually, you're showing, again, I think, Sarah, to what you say about this idea of like this focus on a deficit lens, et cetera. I'm just wondering, the rest of you, like what, when you hear Twila telling those stories, does that resonate with you in the work that you're doing? And how do you think that journalists can, kind of shift their frame so that they can be looking for and telling more of these stories?
Oscar, you can go first on that.
Okay. Well, yeah, one thing that easy thing that comes to mind first is you can easily look up on the Federal Reserve's website who owns stocks in this country. It's like 90% of stocks are owned by white households. Also, it's like 90% is owned by wealthy households. So most stocks are literally owned by the 10% wealthiest white people in the country. So if you're reporting on the stock market, that's all you're talking about. The wealthiest 10% of the country. Okay, so same thing for real estate too, by the way. It's like 80% of real estate is owned by white households, and most of it is owned by, it's a little, because of housing and because of everything that happened in the housing market in the 20th century. It's a little bit more widely spread economically, but anyway. So if you want to report about what's going on in the economy, do you want to talk about just the wealthiest 10% of white households, or do you want to talk about everyone else who are more diverse racially, more diverse economically, also more diverse geographically? I haven't that wealth is also geographically attached to certain places. If you look at New York and California or Massachusetts, you have a lot. Those are the three states where like almost all of venture capital investment goes to those three states. Why? Because that's where most of the rich folks live who have the money to invest in venture investments. So that wealth isn't just class-based; it's also place disparate. Like you're missing out on certain parts of the country just because you're focusing on the stock market or who's the next big Facebook or the next big Google that's going to come out. If you're just talking about like VC funded investments, you're talking about very specific places and very specific people. 98% of venture capital goes to male-owned firms. The majority of that going to white male-owned firms. Again, in the California and New York and Massachusetts, you're missing out on a whole swath of the country if that's all you're reporting on. That alone, I'm just going to stop there because that alone should be alarming to any national editor. This is all you're reporting on. You're reporting on a very limited geographic scope of the country, very limited racial and class scope of the country. So everything else, like that small grocery store that Twila was mentioned, that in some ways it's exceptional, but in many ways it's not, because I can find that same grocery store in every city of the country. And some of those grocery stores are learning about today. One of the things I'm starting to write about is, a grocery store like that, where you have friends and family kind of donating or helping out with cash flow bits and pieces there. In other communities and wealthier communities, those investments, those same bits of cash, they'll get recorded as equity investments and go into the equity baseline of that grocery, of that business. And what does that business do with that equity baseline? It gets to take out a loan against that equity baseline, and it gets to grow and scale. And suddenly, just because you're in a different neighborhood, in a wealthier neighborhood, in a whiter neighborhood, those little bits of cash you get from friends and family are suddenly worth something to a bank. And now you can get access to credit because of where you are, and because the bank thinks, and because you grew up with the banker, you went to school with the banker, you went to college with the banker, and so you're telling, and the banker might be your brother, and your brother, he might be contributing, he might be one of these little investments you're taking in, and your brother's like, hey, by the way, let's talk with a lawyer, let's get wrap all the paperwork around what's happening here and turn these little friends and family investments into a much bigger investment from the bank. That just happens naturally if you live in certain communities. And it doesn't happen in other communities, in part because of us, because of the reporters, the journalists. We haven't taken the time until, maybe in the past few years to really start unpacking the way wealth moves and money moves, and the fact that if you look different, wealth and money move differently. It follows you around depending on how you look, or it avoids you depending on how you look. And that's something that we the media have a responsibility, I think, to unpack.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that it's almost as if you renamed beats in many of our newsrooms by whose power is centered and by whose voices and perspectives are amplified, like 90% of reporters would be on the white men in power beat. And I don't think that wouldn't be acceptable, So it's just, Sarah, you had a comment.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Twila and Oscar just said. And for folks who are familiar with solutions journalism, just a quick definition as we define it as rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So with what Oscar was talking about, I thought of another project we have in our Economic Mobility Initiative, which is Fun Times Magazine, covers the African and Caribbean diaspora in Philadelphia. They did a really great story about susu, about that form of lending from Africa and how it's being applied in different countries, how it's being used in the US. It is that community, people are putting in money, folks are able to access money, access capital for their businesses, for their entrepreneurship. There are ways to formalize it, but then it's really based on people trusting each other. It's really based on relationships. So it's a great story. And at SJN, we're really interested in supporting work like that, stories like that. And when I do workshops and talk with journalists, one of the questions that I ask, because Linda, you asked about how do we shift, how do we do things differently, is I tell people it's great to ask, how do you define success? When you're talking to your sources or you're talking to community, you're trying to get to that more complex story. Part of my background is I worked for a native-owned media company called Keiona Broadcast Corporation for several years, and have done a lot of work in collaboration with Indigenous journalists. And we like to, in that work, it's really important to say, okay, what's the Western model of like success for this tribe, for this issue, for this thing that we're covering? How is the tribe defining success? Are they together, or do they look slightly different? Are there things that are different and that we need to include in our story to tell a more complete story about what success looks like, the evidence that's available to support, that it's working, the insights that people are learning along the way that are worth sharing? Those are all part of the principles of solutions journalism. And so I think starting with, what does success look like for the community? As Twila was saying, like, that sounds like a great success story. And that's absolutely worth highlighting, elevating, doing more coverage of things like that. And saying that everyone being rich is not success. That's not the ultimate goal. This things that are available to the community, opportunities for people to start the businesses that they want to start, that they know will make a difference, being able to support their family. Those are all incredibly important values and examples of success.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd like to welcome Kiana Williamson to our discussion. Hi, Kiana.
Hi, and my apologies to everyone for being late. I had this on my clock for 12 California time. So
it happens. Well, I'm glad you can join us. Everyone, Kiana is the editor of the Equity Lab at the Sacramento Bee. And we'd love to just hear a little, Kiana, about the work you do and why you do it and some of the narratives that you're working to change through the Equity Lab.
Yeah, so at the Sacramento Bee, we decided that we wanted to go into communities and try to uplift voices that had been wanting local media to cover for since the start of media. And so they called me and knew that I was from Oak Park, which is one of the historic communities of Sacramento, and that I had had the opportunity and experience through my upbringing to move through a lot of the communities that have been long ignored and underserved by local media. And so my goal is to engage with these communities, engage with my community, engage with communities that we don't get to because we don't have, or because language barriers, or because they aren't the typical news reader, to get to these communities and to find out what they want, what stories they want us to tell, and what problems they need solved. So that's a little bit about my work and why I do it. And I'm super excited to be here. Apologies again for being late.
I want to ask you, Keiona, about you have like a couple of pillars with the Equity Lab, representation, but also accountability. And I want to ask you about that accountability piece. You know, it was last month, I think, that Marcus D. Smith, the Equity Lab's reporter assigned to covering Black communities, wrote a piece outlining the ways that the B itself has failed to report fairly on Black communities and the harm it has caused, and also how through the Equity Lab, the paper plans to course correct. And so I'm curious, what has been the response from readers, the community, and even your own newsroom to Marcus's piece?
Yeah, so the first, Marcus was hired in October, and oh, sorry, unmute. Marcus signed on with us in October, and the first assignment that he and I had talked about was, we need to figure out how we got this wrong in the first place. And so we went back through almost 150 years worth of coverage to see all the ways in which we have not only ignored Black communities, but have contributed to stereotypes and tropes that are harmful to Black communities. We talked to old writers for the Bee, we talked to longtime subscribers, we talked to community members. We did a thorough investigation into some of the wrongs that the SAC Bee have, you know, just perpetrated over the years. We spoke with our then executive editor, Lauren Gustus, about some of those things. We spoke with our assistant managing editor, Ryan Lillis, about some of the ways in which we want to affect change both inside the newsroom and outside the newsroom. And that article was just sort of the icing on the cake to introduce himself to the community and to tell the community what he found and what he hoped to do better. The response from readers was sympathetic, and it was excited, and it was some impassioned, and felt like the beat was a little unfair, right? Because it's like, you have a Black communities reporter, but what about my community, and what about my community? So to be honest, that showed me that there are so many communities that have felt wronged or has felt underserved and undercovered. And so we have a lot of work to do, but hopefully by showing that it works, and showing that if we cover communities thoroughly and in the voices that are already there versus trying to assign voices to that community, that people will subscribe and people will read the journalism, and then hopefully it snowballs into being able to expand that and become really diverse and actually inclusive with media coverage.
Yeah, thanks, Keiona. That's really exciting, and that kind of narrative accountability. You know, accountability is such a a critical part of changing narratives, right? You have to hold yourself accountable. It's also, so we tend to think of accountability as just like, who in the community are we holding, or in power are we holding to account? But holding ourselves to account also is super important. Before we take a few questions, Sarah, I want to ask you, you mentioned the economic mobility guide that you created with Aubrey at Resolve Philly and their Reframe initiative. And I wonder if you could talk about how a little bit about that reporting guide and how you might see it helping journalists to report on their local economic recovery. Like, there's such good material in there, and we'll make sure everyone has the link to that.
Sure. So the guide includes lots of examples of solutions-focused stories on economic mobility issues like transportation, childcare, housing, opportunities for folks with disabilities, opportunities for immigrant communities. And those come from our story tracker database, which has over 11,000 solution stories, that also anyone can access that to search for stories by geography, by topic, by type of media. So we have some guidance on how to cover those issues and also examples of what it looks like. We also have a language and framing section that I've gotten a lot of really great feedback from journalists so far, both in our cohorts of journalists directly working with us on projects now, and also anyone can access the guide. So we've heard some other folks who've been able to find it on our website. That language and framing guide that Aubrey wrote is just really incredible. It's based on lessons and insights from the Broken Philly Collaborative, which is part of Resolve Philly and involves many partners in Philadelphia who are covering economic hardship and economic opportunity in that city. Just a few things that to highlight the types of things that are in there is Aubrey's recommendations are to use self-descriptive language. And I think that's a really powerful thing that if journalists aren't already doing it, you can do easily, is to ask people how they identify. There's more and more awareness of asking people how, do you identify as Hispanic, as Latino, as Latinx? Do you identify as Black or African American? You can also do that in asking people how do they identify themselves in their economic situation, and also how do they describe themselves and their experience in their community. And that's a really important way of building trust, of making, if someone gives you their time and their energy and they tell you this great story, like the kinds of people Twila's talking to, and then a reporter turns around and deficit frames their community and makes everything look like it's terrible, that person doesn't want to talk to that journalist again, may not want to talk to any journalist again. And we can understand why, right? I mean, people don't like to see, and I know I worked with so many people over the years covering these issues of poverty and economic mobility. And it's not that people want their community to be portrayed in a way that's inaccurate, but to just relentlessly focus on what's negative and the deficits. People know that that's not true. And that doesn't feel right to them. That doesn't feel like an accurate way of describing their community. So it's such an important part of this work. Some other recommendations are to be precise, to not just say a poor neighborhood, a poverty-stricken neighborhood. Be precise about what we're talking about the economic situation, what definitions we're using. Also, the federal definition of poverty misses a lot of folks who are experiencing economic hardship. And we need to get more into that complexity instead of what are people's experiences? How are they dealing with this? What's going on? As Twila mentioned earlier in the session, people first, not label first language is definitely an important recommendation. And also to remember that, poverty is a state, not a trait. And people come in and out of experiencing poverty in the course of their lifetime. And to define people as poor, define an entire neighborhood, just by that is not telling an accurate story, and is also creating mistrust in communities. And we believe, the solutions journalism, that these things matter, that you could tell a story that technically is a solutions focused story, but if it's a white savior story, if it's some of these other problematic, narratives and stereotypes, it's not doing what people intended. We want stories that give people ideas, stories that empower folks, stories that highlight what's actually happening in communities in really complex ways. And so the guide is a starting point with some ideas, some specifics, some inspiration, some stories to look at. And certainly folks can contact me if they want to talk more about any of those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Like I said, we'll make sure that everyone, gets a link to that reporting guide in the resource guide that we'll send out after the webinar. We have a few questions now, and so I'm going to go ahead and take these in the order that they came in. So Travis Bell asks, how do you educate that white male dominant newsroom journalists to report on these important topics, and to think of what or who, as well as to think of what or who defines a source? Who wants to take that?
I can try to pop in. The second question I want to, there's an actionable item and something that we did at the SACB. Perhaps you can rally your colleagues to do a source audit. I think showing data to newsrooms about where exactly we're getting our information from is a huge eye opener for people, right? Because we, as people, we tend to be habitual and we lean on what is comfortable for us. If you champion a source audit in your organization and really break down the ethnicities, the income levels, the gender of the folks that you are getting your information from, it can be a really eye-opening tool to start to shift people's minds.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I guess I didn't think I had an answer to this initially, because I've never actually worked in a white male dominated newsroom. I've been really lucky to work in mostly female women dominated newsrooms, and and also nonprofit newsrooms, and if that matters to anyone. But I've never had to encounter that directly. But Kiana, when you mentioned the source audit, so I'll share link in the chat to the source audit that I've been doing since 2015 when I started writing for Next City. And I've always been tracking this. And it was recently, last year specifically, when Next City actually decided, you know what, Oscar, we're going to try to build a tool internally so that all our reporters can do this. And so now it's becoming institutionalized at Next City that, we're still figuring out, there's so much we have to figure out just in terms of how to even train reporters to ask the question during the interview, like how do you sort of bring it up, because we're also interested in tracking, LGBTQ identities and other kind of more sensitive things that may or may not necessarily have any pertinence to the story, but it's just a way for us to hold ourselves accountable and be able to even have that discussion, just to have that data as a starting point. So yeah, I mean, in one way, I guess I didn't think about it until last year that like I've never had that resistance, and so you can see the results I've had over the past 5 years in terms of the diversity of the sources that I've been able to quote in my stories. But yeah, now we're institutionalizing it, and I think that I would say go ask our executive director or our editorial director about what it's meant to them that I've been doing this. But yeah, tracking the diversity of my sources just as one reporter now has helped change the institution.
I'll just add to that you mentioned accuracy, right? That's come up a couple of times. And in some of the work I did at Minnesota Public Radio when I worked there around changing racial narratives, we did some surveys of media professionals, and we intentionally asked people and used the word accurate. So I think one way is to look at, you were talking about, Oscar, about if you're reporting just on the stock market, you're really reporting on, right, like 10% of the entire population. And then that is not an accurate narrative. And I think journalists generally relate to accuracy, right? So if you talk about diversity only, they can say, well, I tried, or there's a million reasons. And believe me, as someone who helped build a massive database to help diversify sources, that doesn't mean people will use that database. But when they understand that they are putting inaccurate narratives into the world, I think something clicks in journalists because they want to be accurate. And so I think that is and then the other thing I'll just say is something I learned through that project is that it's not just who informs a story or who forms it, meaning like who's the journalist who gets to tell the story, right? But it's who benefits from it. And so I think that there's a way to have a conversation with journalists in a newsroom to start to ask them, like, to actually to talk about who's benefiting from this story and also who's harmed. And just, I think maybe that is one way to start having a conversation. Okay, this question is for Kiana. This comes from Randy Picht, who's the executive director at RJI. He says, with limited resources, how do you set priorities on what to cover and write about?
That's a great question. Two things come to mind. The first one is you're not an organization who lasts 167 years ignoring communities and then all of a sudden just no, right? So we ask. When I first started and when we first announced the Equity Lab, we pushed out Google Forms, and we do that constantly. We probably do a Google Form like every month or so. And they really help. And we don't just send them to our subscribers, but we create a database of communities that we want to engage with, and we send it to them and through those channels. And so, each of our Google Forms gets up to 100, 150 responses. And from there, we start to aggregate what folks want us to talk about. And then the second thing is we're an experiment. So we sort of started with a very wide net and covered what we see most of the community talking about, right? So we would hold listening sessions, we would bring in community leaders and certain folks from different organizations within a community with differing viewpoints. We'd bring them in, we'd ask them questions, and we'll start to get story ideas from that. But now what you'll see from my team, from Alex, is we're going to start focusing specifically on a certain industry, and that's housing. We feel like housing is one of the defining issues of our region at this time, and probably of the country. And so we are going to start to use that as our North Star when choosing which stories to cover. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. Let's try to get to a few more of these quickly. So John Fields wants to know, have you encountered issues with personal bias in your work? And if so, how have you been able to overcome that?
Yeah, that's how it started. That's how this whole thing got started. We thought we knew better than the community we were talking to. That was an absolute bias. As we got further into the process, even after we had our first revelation, we sat down to talk to a young woman who has cerebral palsy. And I realized I have a huge gaping hole in my knowledge base of the disabled community and how they actually live in day to day. And I think it was almost an afterthought when we started to approach it like a ticked box of, oh, we should probably talk to somebody from that community. But then sitting down and actually talking to her, it was like, wait, I don't know anything here, and I don't know nearly enough, and that's ridiculous. I think the thing that helps you the most when you can do that, and that's a piece of advice I can give you because I didn't come from journalism as a background. I don't consider myself a journalist per se. I am a storyteller, first and foremost, is learning how to listen. Like, there's always going to be a point at which you feel like, oh, I'm not sure I know something. I'm not sure I feel comfortable with this, or I'm not sure, or where it bumps right up against what you think you know to be true. Stop and listen, because if you listen, you give yourself the opportunity to have your perspective shifted. You give yourself the opportunity to hear a perspective that's absolutely not your own, or it adds color and context to something that you might have. You may have all your notes and all your things all lined up in a row, but color and context is really important because it frames out how this is going to be perceived. It frames out how people are going to absorb it. That's really important, and that's something you can actually do. That's something that's internal. It doesn't require a course or a class or a preparation or a set of notes or anything else to be able to do. You can actually just stop in the moment and listen to the person that is sharing their experience with you.
Thanks, Twila. This next question comes from Hank Hayes, and I don't know, Sarah, maybe you want to take this one. What are some strategies to pursue if your town isn't diverse? Because mine is not. And as someone, I'll just say, who lived in Wyoming and has, and now in Minnesota, Minnesota, much different experience than living in Utah and Wyoming. So.
Well, the first thing I would say is, how are you defining diverse, and who are you looking for? Because sometimes I think there's an assumption. I had a conversation with a journalist recently. They said, oh, all of our audience is white folks. And someone else on the call said, hey, I'm a brown person and I'm your audience too. And I was like, see, there you go. That's just one person. But like, surely, I think and diversity can be lots of different things. As Twila was just saying, like, I think we definitely don't do enough. And I would say, I don't have all the answers to this because I'm aware of it, but I'm doing work on it. I haven't gotten there yet, but of covering, people with disabilities and like their experience in different places in the world and their experience in their community. I think that's, something too, to hear from people who just have different, there's different levels of diversity. And I think also, going and looking at who is in your community. Like before I was economic mobility manager at SJ, and I was our Mountain West region manager. And there actually is like a lot of these places, they may be predominantly white, but they're not 100% white. There are communities, there are people, there are folks that you can reach out to. You just need to be looking for, where are they? What businesses do they own? What roles are they playing in the community? How are they helping others? What leadership are they offering, and build relationships with them first, maybe before even sourcing or asking them for anything, just to get to know people and to think. You can make yourself a little chart of like different ways in which you're saying there is diversity in my community. Where is it? How can I identify it? Who can speak to these things?
Thanks, Sarah. We have a question from Lisa Rowan. She says, hi, panelists. Do you have any advice for reporters covering the economy at national publications? I spend a lot of time covering those big E indicators, but I'm working to improve my inclusivity and representation when it comes to sourcing experts and finding personal experiences to highlight. So maybe, yeah, what are some other sort of indicators that journalists could kind of use to tell the story of the economic health of their community? I'll just throw one out there. One is, look at the number of like employer-owned businesses and try to disaggregate that information, that data. When we're just talking about statistics or data, it's like about by race and place, because that's something that I've kind of learned from Mike Green, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, right? It's like we're not using the right indicators to really tell the story of the health of our community. Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I guess I can chime in on this one. On indicators, yeah, you want to break things down. Sometimes breaking things down by region or by neighborhood will start to already reveal what else you could, what are the other stories you could be telling. When you look at jobs, for instance, and you say, okay, we're at whatever it is, 6% unemployment now nationally, but among Black communities, it's still 10, 12%. Among Black communities in a place like Chicago or Detroit, it may be at 15 or 20% still. And you're already starting to see, if you just break it down by race and by location. And I mean, just by breaking it down by race, you're already also breaking it down by location, because we live in a segregated country. So now you're talking about specific neighborhoods where the unemployment is much, much higher than the national average. You also want to look at it, you mentioned business ownership. I mean, just think about, in Detroit, for instance, the average white-owned business in Detroit earns $1.3 million a year in revenue. The average Black-owned business in Detroit, $32,000 a year in revenue. That's revenue, not net income. That's top line income, revenue. And just that disparity itself. So now you think, oh, we're creating new businesses, awesome. But new businesses for who? And how much are those businesses earning? Are there businesses that already exist that maybe could go from 1 employee to 2 employees? Are the majority of the businesses in your city in that situation, perhaps, where growing by 1 employee would actually be a huge difference to that city? And they happen to, sole proprietorships are disproportionately Black and brown, right? So like, I mean, you think about in Detroit, like how does someone live on a business that earns $32,000 a year? Well, if you talk to someone from Detroit who's Black or brown, you probably already noticed they have more than 1 business. Everything's a side hustle. Everybody's got more than 1 business in Detroit. That's a common situation. So and you're just talking about like small business growth and revenue growth, and like, okay, so growth for who? You say, okay, New York City wants to invest in tourism again, wants to put like the largest amount of money into tourism promotion it's done in its history. Okay, promotion for which neighborhoods, who will benefit directly? And it's not necessarily bad that Broadway benefits a lot from tourism promotion, because guess who works for and with Broadway? A lot of businesses owned by people of color around New York City that do carpentry. They do their thrift stores where Broadway, production staff go and buy like stuff, like costumes and other things for the set. Like it does matter, and you want to ask yourself, okay, so the city's going to promote tourism. How much of that? How much of the revenue growth will go just to the production houses or the theaters versus the rest of the theater industry? And it may be better or it may be worse than you expect, but like include that part in the reporting, that like When you look at something like we started to see it, I think, last year in something like the Paycheck Protection Program, where hundreds of billions of dollars of loans went out, but because it all happened at once, and journalists fought to get the data out there, we could see, it mostly went to larger businesses that didn't actually need it, mostly white-owned businesses. The businesses that really needed it couldn't get it for different reasons that we're still starting to unpack. That one little story of the Paycheck Protection Program, I think, is starting to filter into the rest of media. Hopefully, like at the national level, it's like, yes, you can see at the national level, the SBA does not know how to get capital to businesses owned by people of color or women. It just for many different reasons, and it's time to start unpacking that as a national story, because we're talking about the SBA. It's the federal government, billions of dollars going out at once, and the pattern that you see in the Paycheck Protection Program is not a departure from the SBA's usual pattern of resources, nor the federal government's usual pattern of resources.
So we are just about at time, but if you all are amenable, I would just like to take this last question, because I think it very much dovetails off what you were saying, Oscar, about like these issues are layered and they are complex. And Max Resnick wants to know, how are you tracking the community's understanding of local economic history in your economic recovery reporting? So yeah, that's a really interesting question about, how much do people understand about the economic history of their own communities, and how can that be incorporated into reporting about the recovery? Thoughts?
I will just say quickly, they understand more than maybe you think. People who live in Black and brown communities, like redlining isn't the thing they read about. It could be, but it's also a thing they've been living through. And many of the sources I encounter, they talk about it. They talk about how their grandparents or the great-parents moved to this neighborhood or this city during the Great Migration. And this is the neighborhood they were forced to live in. And they made the best out of it. My grandfather opened up a grocery store. My father ran it, but then everyone got put in jail, so he had no customers left, and they went out of business. And so now here I am trying to revitalize this commercial corridor in West Oakland. That understanding isn't something, it's not new. It's out there. That layered understanding of what happened to these neighborhoods, how did they become what they are today, how are they changing now? A lot of us we can look back now at the reporting around the Great Recession and the subprime financial crisis, and we can see now how private equity firms came in and swooped in and started buying up all the single family housing that they'd never bought before. Single family houses that used to be wealth for communities, especially in Black and brown communities. Those houses are now rental properties for big private equity firms. We can look back and see that now, but guess who saw that happening 10 years ago? These same neighborhoods. They saw who was coming to the sheriff's sales. They saw what was happening to homes where their grandmothers and uncles and aunts used to live. Now they're all rental homes, market rate rental homes, right? That was all happening back then, and people saw that. And it's up to us to really decide as media, is that a perspective that matters? Or is that just, uninformed poor people, Black people, brown people who don't know anything about the economy? That multi-layered understanding is out there. And it's remarkable how multi-layered the understanding is, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, so much of this just speaks to who, again, who's centered in this reporting. And and it's also about, like, you're thinking about who your audience is. Your audience isn't just sort of explaining the history of a community for your largely white audience, right? You have to understand, like, if you're reporting, this is what you're saying, Oscar, if you're reporting for a community, they know the history of that community and they know the harm that's been caused, and you're not giving them any information they don't already know. And, Keiona, I want to maybe give you the last word, because you talked about how you are doing this deep community listening to inform the entire agenda of how and what you are reporting on. And so I'm wondering if you have any parting thoughts to, media professionals or others on this call about reporting on the recovery and how they can do a better job of listening to the community.
Yeah, I would just what we do and what I love to do are listening sessions. This is something that is one of the most powerful tools that you have, and that's just gathering 10 to 15 folks. We've been doing them on Zoom. It could be everyday folk, church leaders, right? Churches are great places in communities of color to tap into local thought. Pastors, young people, and we just put them in a room. Sometimes we have guided questions. Sometimes when you give people an opportunity to speak, they almost never don't or turn it down. So I would say bringing folks together from different backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, who live in the same community, and just listening to them, you will get a nuanced perspective that will inform your reporting, and I think make it a lot more dynamic.
Well, thank you so much. And with that, I'll just give a quick shout out to one of our partners in the Inclusive Media and Economies Project, which is Local Voices Network. And, this is what they do, right? They will help your news organization if you need some capacity to do that listening and to record and transcribe those conversations. And so we'll make sure that we include a link to LVN in the resource guide. And I just want to thank everyone once again for the time that you've spent with us, and especially to our panelists for sharing their insight and inspiring us with the way they are changing the way we report on the economy, but also the overall narrative about the health of our communities. And with that, we will end this webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and be on the lookout for that resource guide and a link to the recording.